Next up, we have Daniel, a lead engineer at Holler.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the session today. We're joined by Daniel at Holler, which is a really interesting company, one that I didn't know a lot about till I started spending time with Daniel. Daniel, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, that would be fantastic. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jonah. My pleasure to be here. I'm a lead engineer at Holler, and I primarily work on web services, cloud infrastructure, and more recently, DevOps. And since I've joined Holler, it's been my goal to increase visibility into our systems and really reduce the amount of time it takes us to resolve problems. We've been growing very quickly over the last year, so there's been a lot of interesting challenges along the way, going from a small startup to something that's a little more mature.
Cool. And what did you do before you joined Holler, just to give people a little background on where you came from?
Yeah, so kind of interestingly, I've been a developer for 10, 12 years now, but my most recent job before this was actually not doing as much development. It was at an education company where we were building a online education platform to do emerging technologies video courses. So while half my job was working on the platform to support the videos, the other half was actually being an instructor and doing all the AV work and figuring out that world.
Oh, that's really cool. Nice. And particularly relevant in this day and age when everyone has to learn how to distance learn. So definitely you were ahead of the curve on that one.
Yeah,
Could
definitely.
you tell us a little bit about what Holler does for those that aren't familiar with the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a messaging technology company, and today we mainly create and deliver animated stickers to a network of partner applications. Venmo is one where you've probably seen our content the most. And as a company, our goal is to build technology that enriches conversations. As more and more conversations happen through chat and through digital means, we think there are certain human aspects that start to be lost. It's just harder to convey things like empathy. And we hope we can bring some of that back. And our goal is to do that everywhere and be ubiquitous, ideally. So our model is to provide SDKs on both iOS and Android, and our partner apps integrate with them. And
Cool.
that SDK is, sure. And the core functionality is to provide relevant contextual recommendations of content. And what's really neat about Holler is, while we are a tech company, more than half of our team is actually an animation studio. So we produce all this content in-house. And we're also looking beyond stickers too. So our big thing now is, how do we take this beachhead of stickers and figure out what other types of content we can use to enrich conversations?
Yeah, definitely is a common problem and seems like a difficult problem to solve. How does the tech stack look over there in terms of where you're hosting and how you're running the service?
Yeah, we're on AWS, and our main APIs and a lot of our web services we write in Go. Amazon's been really helpful in terms of all the different things they give you around auto scaling groups and managed container hosts and Kubernetes. And today, most of our services are built in a more traditional fashion. Web servers running on EC2 instances in auto scaling groups. And our data pipeline is a pretty traditional Apache-based stack with Kafka and Storm and Spark. And all of it is pretty much run by us, but we are in a big movement now to move more towards containers, microservices. We're looking very hard at EKS from a transition from ECS, and just kind of part of that maturation process as we try to use our engineering resources more effectively on our product-based goals.
Right. And so speaking of that and the change that you're trying to make, how are the teams structured today, or how's your team structured today?
Yeah, so our technology organization is split into two big buckets. We have a research and data science team that operates out of California, and they work on all the natural language understanding and NLP that we hope to drive more and more of our recommendations with. And then the engineering team, which I'm part of, is based here in New York City. And we're a pretty small team, and we are still small enough where we don't really have to break up into subdivisions. It kind of, on a sprint by sprint or quarter by quarter basis, we're kind of building special ops teams, for lack of a better term, to focus on particular projects rather than having long running teams that always exist.
So when something comes up like that disrupts the flow, do you just sort of figure out who's going to handle it and how you're going to deal with it? Because that's obviously pretty disruptive to trying to get to your end goals and meet what you're trying to deliver in the sprint, for example.
Yeah, we still have a pretty specialized team in the sense that particular pieces of code or projects have one or two people that you will go to resolve certain issues. But yeah, you were right. One of the biggest things we have with trying to keep up a cadence on product goals is just stuff popping up that requires our attention that drags us completely off that roadmap for some time.
Yeah, so speaking of that, obviously you've gone through an observability journey, especially you mentioned the scaling challenges that the team has been meeting. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your evolution and where you see things going around the ability to better see how your software is executing?
Yeah, in a sense, we have a cautionary tale because for the longest time, there was really not much in the way of monitoring or observability. And that bit us a couple of times in a big way as we grew. It seemed like one day we were a small company where we didn't really need this stuff. And then not that much longer, we have a problem that's costing us a lot of money because the mean time to resolution is so high. And some of these problems we had, unfortunately, were the type where we're storing more data than we need to, or having to run a bunch of extra compute to handle some weird behavior from our fleet of SDKs. And remember, being an SDK driven company, we don't have a lot of control over the client side. We can't just say, hey, shut us off. Like, that data is probably going to come from these millions and millions of devices, whether we want to or not. And one small bug in our kit could introduce a lot of extra data. So yeah, for the longest time, we didn't have a lot. And then kind of trial by fire, realized we really got to beef up how fast we can resolve these problems, both for our customers and for our Amazon bill.
Yeah, for sure. So what did you start with there? Was it like metrics, logs? Like, how was the progression and sort of what you were thinking around it?
Initially, metrics were just whatever you get out of CloudWatch for free, which can be very limited in certain scenarios. Like, I remember memory not being part of the baseline metrics being a big issue, memory usage. And we had our own Elk stack for the longest time for log aggregation. And that worked great. But as the traffic kicked up, I haven't mentioned this yet, but we don't have in-house operations as of yet. We're looking to build out that team right now, but still to this day, it's engineers playing double duty as like operations, DevOps, and the people that build the product. So as that traffic grew, the Elk stack became pretty much unusable just due to performance, and no one was spending the time to do the sort of things you have to do to Elasticsearch to really have it scale appropriately. But we really liked Elk, so we wanted to stick with it. And finding a managed Elk provider in Logz.io actually was what helped us kind of move past that hurdle, because all the knowledge we had around Elk and Kibana, it felt safe. Like, we liked the technology, it's just taking the management off our shoulders. And at the same time, we realized we needed more metrics, and that's when we started just covering everything in the infrastructure with MetricBeat or Telegraph, to start shipping that over to Logz.io as well to help with our observability, because CloudWatch just wasn't cutting it after a certain point.
Yeah, it makes sense for sure. Common challenge, definitely. You sort of piqued my interest when you mentioned that you're kind of building an ops team. Is that more to let the engineers focus on building the applications and maybe less so running infrastructure? Or what's the thinking between the ops team and what you're trying to do organizationally? Yeah.
It's almost 100% what you said. It's just, we don't want engineers having to deal with operations stuff as much, because it takes them away from the product roadmap, which is already a big task as it is. But it's also just reliability thing. Having a team ideally distributed in different time zones that can handle the round the clock stability issues as well. But yeah, it's mainly just trying to focus the engineering resources on what we want to be great at, which is not necessarily, running operational infrastructure. It's building this product out.
Yeah, there's just a lot of like tribal knowledge and ownership, and obviously the developer that wrote the code or knows the code is always the best at supporting it, but it's a balancing act where that person probably also has a lot of business knowledge and can help drive the roadmap forward. So it's definitely a balancing act, for sure. So you also mentioned the move towards microservices and where you're going there. How do you think that's going to change your observability goal? I mean, are you going to introduce new types of data, any tracing, or just new ways of doing data collection as part of that change?
Yeah, well, again, looking back and seeing how painful not having coverage on services can be, we're taking that as a lesson and saying anything we build in our new microservices oriented fashion has to have some certain things baked in. So it's not an option to exclude them from projects. And on top of that, it's just, we realize that microservices introduce complexity. Any distributed system, as it gets more and more distributed, and there's more network traffic and all that, it gets harder to manage. And if we don't take care to get the metrics right, we'll be in even more pain than we have been when we didn't have coverage on more legacy systems. So to that end, we're taking the time with the microservices to, day one of this initiative is, well, we want to get cracking on the microservices that will drive the product. We're taking time initially to first build a framework that any engineer can use and basically make it as hard as possible to get the observability piece wrong. So there's distributed tracing built in. There's kind of boilerplate code. There's structured logging, so all the logging is coming in a unified way with the same logging levels and the different fields that we consider key. The containers and all will have the metrics built in. So anytime a new container is spun up on our Kubernetes cluster, then it'll all be kind of handled. So a developer can just focus on what is my business logic that I'm putting into this service, and not have to worry about the rest, which is perhaps simple, but a big change for us organizationally.
Yeah. There's actually a lot of interesting work going on in the open standards, specifically in open telemetry, where the current debate happening now that's kind of interesting is exactly how and what you should structure in terms of your metrics and logs. So hopefully as that standard matures, people will start logging and calling metrics by standard names, which will make it much easier to make sense of the data. It's definitely still a challenge, but doing that framework approach definitely will help enable developers to do the right thing when they're writing the code, which is for sure the right direction there. I mean, it sounds like the team is pretty focused and has been for quite some time on open source. Has that been a journey, or were you always just completely open source based from the beginning?
I'd say we're almost completely open source from the beginning, and with a few encounters where we looked at more proprietary technologies, but it became clear to us that compared to, speaking of observability, the big tools and New Relic and Datadog and Rollbar, like those tools are great, but we found that the pricing model, which is usually based on hosts, for example, scaled really poorly with our team, because as our host count grew, it doesn't always mean revenue or the number of engineers on your team is growing. So you see this one cost going up and up and up. So essentially the open source technology scaled a lot more elegantly in that way. But also the flexibility piece is huge, that it's a lot easier to hire DevOps people or whatever it is when you're using technologies that everyone typically knows, and also the flexibility being able to migrate. Like with this distributed tracing thing, we intend to use Jaeger, and initially we'll host our own Jaeger infrastructure with the idea that, just like Elk that's probably not going to be something we want to do in the future, and we just need to find a managed Jaeger provider, and it's just a quick switch rather than investing all this time in your team learning Jaeger, how to run Jaeger, and then moving to some other tool. It's just churn that we don't see any reason to take on. And to your last point about open telemetry, opinionated software is great. I think the less cognitive load you can put on product developers and engineers to make the decisions that matter to the product and avoid, what fields do I need to include in my distributed tracer or whatever it is just a win.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we actually have our Jaeger solution in private beta right now, but we're definitely going down that path, and there's a lot of evolution taking place in that area. You'll definitely enjoy the panel discussion that was recorded where we discussed a lot of these things that have been happening in the industry. But I was also sort of interested, like you decided not to run your own Kubernetes and use the Amazon service. So like, how do you personally or the company think about like when I'm going to use a platform service that maybe Amazon provides me versus running my own, or even going to a third party? Like if you were to decide we don't want to run our Kafka, do you look at Amazon Kafka, or do you look at a third party that runs Kafka? I mean, what's kind of the thinking behind some of that for you or the company?
Yeah, I think the leaning is generally towards running open source technology, or using open source technology but not running it would be the preferred state. Like we'd rather use Amazon's managed Kafka rather than run our own Kafka. Yeah. And if it works, we'd rather use that than something completely proprietary like a fire hose where we're just locked in.
Right.
And in general, at this stage of the company, we're in a very buy versus build scenario for anything that's not, like we're trying to be laser focused on the product again. So if we don't have to run it, we prefer to, but time and time again, it's a migration where, going back to Kafka, where MSK looks great and we do it for a while, but at scale, it's like, there's a breaking point where we think we should spend the time to manage it ourselves just because the costs get out of control, which is always a concern for a Series A stage startup like us. So that's kind of the general thinking. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously going to change based on like the growth and the climate and all kinds of other things that are happening. So it makes sense to always have to balance it, but it's important to weigh all the options for sure. Cool. I think we sort of answered everything that we were going to talk about today, but did want to open it up if there was any closing remarks that you had or anything that you wanted to mention. Otherwise, we can wrap things up.
Yeah, definitely. Holler is hiring at the moment. The biggest thing we'd love to have at the moment is a keystone hire for our SRE DevOps role. So like I said, we don't currently have anyone focused on that full time. We just have engineers playing dual duty, which is great because we're all learning a ton. But now that I've spent time for the last few months kind of wearing that hat, I realize like it's such a cool space and it really deserves someone to focus on it and take the company to the next level. So yeah, Kubernetes clusters, infrastructure monitoring, Amazon Web Services. We're just looking for someone who lives and breathes that stuff and wants to level up our game.
Yeah. You're looking for people in the New York area as well, or are you open for more distributed applicants?
Yeah, we're looking for someone in the New York City area. Of course, at the moment, it would be a remote job, but the intention would be to move back into the Midtown office whenever it's safe to do so and makes sense.
Yeah, we all hope that day comes soon when we can get together and socialize a little more. But for now, we have to live inside Zoom and our homes and do what we can, right?
Yeah, it's been a transition. I think Holler in particular is working very effectively, but we all miss the culture at the office. It is a very fun environment. Like I mentioned earlier, it's like a half an animation studio and half a tech company. So it's a very interesting vibe we get in the office, and it's fun.
Cool. Well, I hope to come visit when I make it to New York next, and just wanted to thank you for your time and the great insight and conversation today.
Yeah, you have to visit, and thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Daniel and Jonah. It's really interesting to hear about all the benefits of open source, but also why it can be hard to run on your own. I just wanted to give a reminder to make sure that you're logging into our Slack community. There's a lot of really interesting conversations being had